Have you ever heard a musical artist described as having great chops? What does that mean? Well, the term chops is slang in the music business that refers to an artist that has developed great skills over time, whether they are a musician, composer, producer, or other titles associated with the music business. This is Scott Grimaldi, your host of Got Chops. Join me as I interview one musical artist per episode that I've had the pleasure of either performing, recording, or work with in my career. Plus, I'll be interviewing artists I've always wanted to speak with. We'll discover how each artist developed their chops, listen to their stories, and much more. This is Got Chops. The track playing behind me is an iconic pop song, Saturday in the Park, that ranked number 3 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100 charts of 1972 and recorded by the rock group Chicago from their 5th studio album. Today's special guest artist was the recording engineer on this song, including engineering multiple other Chicago albums. Between his titles of senior recording engineer at CBS Records in New York and chief engineer at Caribou Ranch in Colorado, his engineering credits besides Chicago include Elton John, Weather Report, Billy Joel, The Beach Boys, REO Speedwagon, Edgar Winter, and the list goes on and on. Plus, working alongside of legendary music producers that include James William Guercio and Phil Ramone. After his recording engineering career came to a close, this gentleman decided to pursue yet another career path, following in his dad's footsteps as a master instrument technician, including his passion of restoring vintage brass and woodwind instruments. I'm proud to call him my woodwind technician, including his father and son, who have taken care of all my woodwinds for the past 40 years and have given me excellent personalized service. This highly gifted and talented musician definitely got chops. Please welcome my friend and woodwind tech, Wayne Tarnowski. Hi, Wayne. How are you?
Hey, nice to speak to you, Scott, and of course your listeners.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Before we go on, I just wanted to let you know that one of your clients, a friend of ours, says to say hi. I was in Atlantic City this past weekend at Harrah's Resort and Casino. I had a whole slew of shows there for these. It was called the East Coast Music Hall of Fame, and the artists from the 50s, 60s, people you probably know already. And in the saxophone section was Rick Brunnemer, so he said to say hi to you and Chris.
Rick's a great guy. He really is. He's been a customer for such a long time, such a fine player, and I've done some things to Rick's horns, which are really, Rick's horn is very unique. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit when we get to speaking about my instrument tech career. So
absolutely. And I've known Rick for, I think, a little bit less than you've known him, but because we had some time to talk between the acts, he told me an interesting story about how sad story about how his tenor and Barry got run over, and I was like, oh my God! So
yeah, that's a musician's nightmare.
Oh,
and I mean, you know, most musicians are very, very attached to their instruments. I mean, literally, it is a part of them. And when something gets damaged so badly as Rick's horns did, I mean, it's just you know. I mean, it's traumatic almost, you know. And I know Rick loves that horn. He still wants to try to get it up and running. And we may be able to do that. We're talking about it. But it was really severely damaged, and it's going to be quite a job to get it working again.
Yeah, he was saying that it was just a really fascinating story, but he's got some comparable instruments, and he sounded great. He was playing Barry sax, and I was playing tenor, and then we had another alto player. So before Wayne was an instrument tech, his livelihood, his career was a recording engineer, and he was the senior recording engineer for CBS Records in New York. He has recorded some of the most iconic artists in the world, I should say. Chicago, Weather Report, REO Speedwagon, Edgar Winter, Ted Nugent, not bad. And then he was the chief engineer at Caribou Ranch in Colorado. We'll talk about that a little later. Once again, recording for Chicago, the Beach Boys, Joe Walsh, Chaka Khan, Elton John, Billy Joel, Earth, Wind & Fire. Wow, that's quite a list. So what does the music slang got chops mean to you?
Well, first of all, I have to pay you a compliment, Scott, because if, Scott Grimaldi Music Podcast were to be a hit record, Got Chops would be the hook. And I mean, any hit record has like a phrase or a lyrical content that the audience seems to always hum or sing along with. And Got Chops certainly is something that's going to get the attention of anybody that's been a musician. Because it'll just kind of do a flashback to all those times that they were woodshedding, in their room to learn how to, master their instrument. And to me, it's very much the same as well. I mean, I can remember those times when I was practicing for hours and hours and hours to get something, correct and to the point where I really thought that I had it. But it is more than that, too, I believe, in that, when you finally do get chops and you've mastered your instrument and you're proficient at it, you have to continue to earn it. And most of the musicians that I know and I've seen and I've been with, they go out there and they earn it every night when they're playing. So chops is something that you have to, always work at and always practice, as well as, this works in almost any field, whether you're an accountant, a lawyer, anything. I think you always work at it and you practice your craft. So that's what chops means to me. I hope I hope your listeners can understand what I'm saying to you, because I really have, been around some of the most fantastic musicians in the world, and they really all have chops. But the most gifted ones are the ones that the music doesn't come from them; it comes through them. And in order for that to happen, you have to have chops. So that's my idea of chops, and again, I think it's a great phrase, and it's a great way to get somebody talking about their career and what they've done in their life.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words, and I'm sure my listeners are hearing exactly what you're saying, and I often tell my students almost the same thing as you're saying, but I would say it in a way that you have to maintain. And the other thing from the business is you're only as good as your last gig. So
isn't that the truth?
Oh my God, absolutely. Everyone in this business goes through that same thing. So when I told my students, I have a gig this weekend, and I have to maintain my chops, and they're looking for a certain style, a certain sound, a certain mouthpiece. And if I don't study that, I'm at the wrong gig. So even at my age, I have to still maintain.
You're absolutely right, Scott. So important. It really is. And the musicians that really go far practice that thought and that concept all the time.
Absolutely. So you grew up in Rahway, New Jersey. So besides your dad being a professional bari sax player and a professional instrument technician, was it a musical household?
I would say this, I've been asked that question many times before, and as you know, my father was a big band musician, and he played saxophone and clarinet. But my mother was not very musical at all. Okay, so I often answer that question by saying that I grew up in a musical father, so to speak, because my father really kind of directed, my interest in music. And I can remember when I was very, very young. I was born in 1947, and it's just like kind of I would say it was the end, but it was still kicking around. Big bands were very, very popular. My father played like 6 nights a week and twice on Sunday. So often, that time there were not, or my grandmother would babysit for me every once in a while, but a lot of the times my father, if it was local, he would just take me on the gig with him. So I kind of grew up, next to the bandstand. I would go and listen to the whole gig and, be next to the bandstand. Most of the time, it's interesting for, I think, some of your listeners that during that period of time, they would just like take a tennis court, take the nets down, put a bandstand up, and it was a dance, okay, that would go on for like 4 hours. So that's the kind of like environment that I grew up in. And I think it really, really, got my interest in music to, a very large degree. And it was probably the reason that I, eventually ended up in the music business, because I think to be that entrenched in it is really what spurs the interest of almost anybody that's interested in music.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. And for the young listeners back then, they were called dance bands. It came right out of the swing era of the 1940s, but a dance band, that's what it was.
Yep. And of course, he would play picnics. I would go to the picnic with him. I mean, there were some places that I couldn't go with him if he was, in a bar or something like that. I couldn't go there, and then my grandmother would take care of me. But I mean, I had music in my life from like the very, very beginning.
I understand you studied piano with the great jazz pianist Morris Nanton and vibes with the legendary percussionist Billy Dorn. What age did you begin lessons with both of these gentlemen, and what was it like to study with them?
Well, Morris actually was my last teacher. He was the last teacher that I had, and there were many, many teachers before him. Billy Dorn was kind of like in the middle of my musical career. And I mean, I think probably your listeners will understand that as you start, becoming a student of your instrument, you go through periods of when your interest is high and when it's somewhat low too. And usually that was for my father was the point at which he would either change a teacher or maybe get me another instrument. I mean, at that time, even when I was studying piano from the age of 5, he would get me interested in playing the clarinet so I could play in the school band and saxophone. And the Billy Dorn story was kind of one of those type of situations. My dad used to work for a company, a music store in northern Jersey, and he would take the instruments that he was fixing for them back to them. And often I'd go on those trips. And in the store one day when we were there was this set of Deegan vibes in the corner. And I mean, for me, it was like really interesting because, I knew what they were, but I never played them. And again, of course, the store owner let me play them because I was my dad's son. And, I really took an interest in it. My father saw that. And next week, lo and behold, the vibes showed up at the house.
Wow.
And he said, I'm going to get you a really good vibe teacher so that you can play these and go out and play them on a gig. So that's how the Billy Dorn story came up. Now, Billy was a very well-known percussionist. I mean, Billy wrote the books on xylophone and marimba. And he was, a very famous player. He played with the New York Philharmonic. He was an incredibly talented, xylophonist. And he didn't actually, when I was taking lessons from him, I took lessons on the xylophone. And, I would practice on the vibes when I got home. But it was like an incredibly interesting thing for me because it piqued my interest in music again. And I did play it with bands, like when I was in high school, and it was a fun thing to do for me, and really, as I say, piqued my interest. Now, the situation with Morris was another one of those situations, and that was because my dad, saw me losing a little bit of interest in the piano again, and he took me into a club called Espos, and he said, "Come on, I'm going to take you. I want you to listen to somebody play." He took me into Espos, and there Morris was playing with a piano trio, piano, string bass, and drums, and I just my eyes and ears almost fell out of their sockets, when I heard him play, and my father said to me, "How'd you like to take lessons from that guy?" And I mean, I flipped out. I really did. He was an incredibly important person in my musical career because he really did take me from reading music and, playing what was written to the point where I learned how to improvise. He taught me musical theory. Of course, he was a Juilliard graduate, so I had a lot of Bach and Oscar Peterson. It was from Bach to Oscar Peterson and everything in between. He had some really strange methods of teaching. When I first started taking lessons from him, he would make me play with kid gloves on, a very, very tight kind of leather skin glove, and we would cut the tips off, and that was to strengthen my hand.
Wow!
And he'd make me transcribe Oscar Peterson records for my ear training, so that I would have to be able to transcribe it and play it, and that was part of my lesson for the next week. So I can remember sitting next to the piano with this record player with me, and the only way in the beginning I could get it is I would have to turn the record from 33 down to 16 so I could get the intervals and pick out the notes and the timing of it. But it was an important thing for me to learn, ear training and technique.
Absolutely. So when did you begin to get serious with the vibes and the piano? So what age and how long did you practice all this stuff?
Well, in the beginning, when I even first started playing, my father said, an hour is the minimum. And so that was like even when I was, 5 to 10, 12 years old, an hour was the minimum when I really started to, get a real interest in it. It was kind of like when I got home from school at 3, usually I'd go to dinner time, which was either 5 or 6 or something like that. So it was, when I really got serious about it, I think you really have to put in 2 or 3 hours for sure.
To go back to Morris Natton, for those of you out there that have never heard that name, as Wayne just said, an incredible jazz pianist, very well studied. I was at Berklee College of Music, and one of the summers where I came home, my father said, "Hey, I just read something about this jazz pianist that's going to be at the Cove in Perth Amboy." He says, "Why don't you take your horn? Let's see if he'll let you sit in." I said, "Okay." So we went, introduced myself to him. A very young Billy Hart was playing drums. So,
Right.
oh my God, I had the chance to sit in. He was, very accommodating, really nice. Give me a nice shot there. I played, I think, 2 or 3 songs. It was just really great, how these guys would just give back and give to someone young and say, sure, you got to get your feet wet. Come on up. So
Absolutely.
that was a pivotal point in improv for me back then.
Well, he was a wonderful person on that. Even like when he was playing at the Cove, he would bring a lot of people up. Either a singer or that was my first shot. Really, was he brought me up to sit in at the Cove, and that was like the first time I had really realized that I had something that people enjoyed listening to. It was like a real shot in the arm for me, as it was for you, Scott.
Oh, you can't explain that feeling. It's like,
No, you
okay,
can't.
it kind of well, I know it does. It justifies all those hours of practicing, and then all of a sudden the aha light goes on in your head. That's
Right.
why I'm doing all this stuff. This is great. So what got you interested in studying to become a recording studio engineer? I know you received your degree in electrical engineering at NJIT. Is that correct?
That's correct. There is a rather interesting story that goes along with that. When I was a junior in high school, that's the time that usually, what you're going to do for college
Mm-hmm.
comes up. And I was at that point, I was like really doing so well with Morris that I said, I spoke to him and I said, I'd really like to go to Juilliard, Morris, and, study the piano very seriously. And, in my own mind, Scott, it was like, hey, listen, I want to become the next great jazz musician, jazz pianist. And Morris said to me, Wayne, I think you really could make the audition. You're really good. I can help you with it. I know some people there, and I think it'd be great if you did that because you really do have some talent. It was a conversation that we had, and at that point, I went to my mom and dad, and I said, I really think this is my calling. I'd really like to do it. I love the piano so much, and I think Morris can help me, and he thinks that I can get into Juilliard, and what do you think? And after everything that I've told you about my father, promoting my musical career, you'll be shocked to know that my father was like very much against it.
Really?
And yes, and that is, it's interesting because, I think at that time, and this is kind of later in this is like maybe I was probably 15 or 16 when this was going down, and the music business had changed somewhat, and my father was seeing that. He was seeing that it was becoming harder and harder to make a living at music. Whereas in the, when I was first born in like the late 40s, the early 50s, music was everywhere. People were playing, but it slowly had kind of gone down to, a combo bands. Big bands were kind of, I don't want to say dying, but there was a change taking place where it was small ensembles rather than a large big band, and they weren't dancing anymore. It was more kind of like a concert type of setting, and he knew because he had, he was a musical technician, and all the musicians were bringing their instruments to him, and he would get kind of feedback, hey, there's not as many jobs anymore, and the first thing he would ask the customer when they came in is like, so how you doing? What's going on out there? Where you been playing lately? And he would get the feedback. So what he was really saying to me is, he was saying, you may want to rethink that. And he was kind of dead set against it, and which is really, really odd. And we had, knockdown, drag out fights about it for like months. And finally he won he won out, you know. He said to me, listen, you're really good at math, you're good at science, you get good grades in school, you know, you're very mechanical, you know, I think you'd make a great engineer, you know. And that's how I ended up, you know, applying to engineering schools in the area. And I, you know, one of the schools that accepted me was, it was then called Newark College of Engineering. It's now NJIT. So that's what I did, you know. He kind of convinced me that, you know, that was the right move for me. And of course, you know, like when I went to college, I continued playing. I mean, I was playing like 5 nights a week, even when I was in college, because Morris and I would take turns at the Cove. I would play Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then Morris would come in with the trio on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Wow.
So all through my college career, I would play. I was playing like 5 nights a week. When he was like, you know, I would do weddings and, you know, affairs and stuff on the weekend when he was, you know, when he was playing at the Cove. So it really was, you know, I didn't kind of decide that I wanted. I kind of like submitted to going to engineering school is what it came down to.
Well, what I hear is, I mean, because I know you're a very caring, emotional, and talented person, but you have a very logical way of looking at things. So I can see why the engineering part of your brain noticed that reality and said, okay, and I don't have to give up the piano.
Right. And that was the saving grace for the whole thing, is that I could continue to play, you know, and I did all the way through college.
So I know you have album credits as the senior recording engineer at CBS Records in New York for iconic artists that include REO Speedwagon, Weather Report, Ted Nugent, Edgar Winter, and Chicago. Besides these artists, please tell my listeners how you got hooked up with legendary producers like Phil Ramone and recording in other studios that included the Record Plant.
Okay, well, I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Sure.
While I was in college, I mean, you get one of those points where you have to take an internship. I mean, I don't think it was a requirement, but it was a heavy recommendation that you take an internship when you're, in the summertime when you don't have your studies. So I did take an internship for a company that designed power stations for like a PS&G, and I became like a draftsman for them. That was my job. You know, the senior engineer would come up with a scribbled piece of paper with a design on it, and it was my job to take that design and, you know, meticulously put it on to a blueprint with straight lines and you know, neat writing and all that stuff. And what ended up happening is I hated the job. I really did. And I said to myself, I can't do this. Like when I got out of college, there's no way that I can, you know, I'm not going to be happy doing this. I knew that kind of instinctively. And what I did while I was in college, I've always been kind of like a hi-fi nut, you know. I think the term is audiophile. And I had a really good set of, speakers in my room and like amplifiers and stuff like that. I was interested in because I was generally interested in music and I wanted to hear it well, you know. So what I did was I bought myself from my, you know, the money that I made on my music gigs, I bought myself recording gear. I bought myself a tape recorder, a bunch of microphones, and I would just go out everywhere that I could to record anybody that wanted to get recorded. And, you know, I would do it for almost like gas money, you know, just to get the experience of doing it. And that's kind of what I was doing all the way through college, just like going out and recording a band here and there. I mean, I would record a garage band if they're trying to, like, you know, write a song or something like that and they wanted a demo. I would do that for them. So that was the kind of the thing that I did while I was in college. Now, when I graduated, it took me 4.5 years to graduate. It was a 4-year program, but the last year I needed some extra credits and I had to stick around. So I kind of like had to do one more semester to get my degree in electrical engineering. When I got the degree, I said, I am determined I'm going to be a recording engineer. And I went to every single recording studio in New York City, and I had my resume, and, I didn't have much of a resume other than I was doing this kind of like on my own, and I had a degree in electrical engineering, which was my major. And most of the studios that I went to, Scott, they say, well, listen, you're like way overqualified for this job, man.
Really?
Yes. They said, like usually, we start people out like as setup guys, and you move, boom microphones around, and you tear down the setup when the session is done, and you go out and you get coffee, and if you're lucky, maybe you'll get a chance to do a demo if like a band comes in and the engineers, that usually would do it. So you'll get your chance somehow, and we'll give you $50 a week to do this. And I came back to my mother and father and said, well, listen, these guys offered me $50 a week. I think I'm going to take it. My mother and father almost had a canary because they had sent me through college for, 4.5 years, and to start out at $50 a week, sounded like I was really stupid. The saving grace to all at the end of the story is that one of the places that I had dropped my resume was with CBS Records. And at that time, CBS Records had a program that they had just started, which was called an apprentice program. And CBS Studios was in New York City on 57th Street, was a union shop. It was, in other words, all the engineers that worked there were part of 802, which is the IBEW, which is the Electrical Workers Union. And because of that, even starting as an apprentice, there was a pay scale that was decent. And I went there, I spoke to the supervisor of the studio, and he was impressed that I had a degree in electrical engineering, and consequently, I got the job. So I became an apprentice, which meant that I was only allowed to operate the equipment with a senior engineer present. So I did that for 6 months, I would say, and after 6 months, everybody, gave me good reports on how I was doing, and they made me a senior engineer after 6 months. I was supposed to be an apprentice for a year, but I kind of finished it in 6 months because I at least was, one, I was a musician. Two, I had, made my own experience of, doing my own recording with my own equipment, so I knew what I was doing. And that's how my career began, was at CBS Records. And at that time, you got to, I'll say this: they would book the dates for you, and CBS Records, most of the artists that were recording on CBS at that time would use their studios, but not all of them did. So I got a chance to, one, learn from the best engineers in the world at CBS, and if an artist was doing a session at a studio that wasn't CBS studios, say like the Record Plant or the Hit Factory or A&R or any other one of the other studios in the city, a CBS engineer had to be present. So I got to, as well as doing, the records, artists in CBS studios, I got to watch other engineers work as well. which is kind of the story with Frankenstein. The fellow that did the engineering and who I collaborated with on that record his name was Bill Simzik. Bill had done the Eagles, Joe Walsh. I mean, he was just a kind of legendary, engineer producer. And I got to work with him. I got to work with other, Jack Douglas over at the record plant. I got it to sit in on those, and I learned an incredible amount from working at CBS Records. One of the kind of turning points at when I was working there is I had a session with Al Cooper.
Oh, wow.
And if your audience doesn't remember or know who Al Cooper was, he really kind of started Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Right.
And he was, he was a legendary, musician. He played on Bob Dylan's records, and he was a record producer. And he was a very, very knowledgeable guy. He was a really kind of nice guy too. He liked me. We were doing a session one day for, I think it was Mike Broomfield. I think that was the session. I really can't remember the session that well. But at one point during the session, the group that was out there kind of got into a little bit of an argument about what direction the track was going in, and they kind of stopped, and they were talking about it, and then maybe we got a little bit heated about it. And Al was in the control room with me because the mics were open, and there happened to be a 45 RPM record on the producer's console, and Al picked up the record, and he showed me the record, and he said, "See this record, Wayne? There's a lot of big egos that have to fit on all these small grooves in this record." And what he was really saying to me is, you don't need to add your ego to it, and you really have to kind of check your ego at the door, at the control room door when you walk into a studio, because it's really all about the artist, and it has to be right for them. And that's something I always remembered. I always remember that, it was like a lesson that I was taught there, that, you're just part of the whole project, okay? And what's really on the record is the artist and the musician. And it's your job to just amplify that, so to speak, and become a part of it and make it happen, but not direct. It has to be what the artist has in their mind.
Well, it's funny you said that. I want to add to a couple of things here that you were talking about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When I did my album a few years ago, the engineer was great, the studio was great, and then all of a sudden, because you're working on something for a number of months, especially if you don't have a record deal and you're the person putting all the money out, some days I'd walk in, and I won't say who, "Hey, listen, look what I did with track 4." And they would take liberties, and, I made a dance hit out of it. I said, "Did you check with me? I didn't issue that." "Yeah, but listen how great it is. I know I can get this played."
Right.
"I appreciate you putting all that work into it, but I'm not paying you for that. I didn't ask you to do that, and I don't give you permission to put that out."
Well, I mean, there is something to that, because there are engineers that do have a very large ego, and they somehow feel as the whole thing's about them and it's their record. And yes, their name is on the record, but it's not their record, Scott. It's your record.
You come from an era where, yes, I'm the recording engineer. If you want my advice, I'll certainly give it to you. But you and I both know a number of engineers that became producers because they were there at the right time in the right place, and then they would delegate. But they didn't have the experience that a real producer, like the people that you've worked for, that could do that. So they were a flash in the pan for a little while.
Absolutely.
If I could also comment on a couple other things that you said, because you're a true musician, you studied theory and harmony and your instruments and you practiced, you come from that era that I really appreciate, and I really don't see it now when I do studio work, mostly because it's in home studios. When I used to go with the people that I was recording with that took me under their wing, I remember going into the booth and the engineer was given a full score. And the producer, the conductor, the arranger who's conducting the orchestra would talk to the engineer through the mic. Okay, at letter B, where the trombones come in here, they knew what they were talking about.
Right. It's very important. But I mean, I would say this. I would advise anybody that thinks they want to be a recording engineer, and I get this all the time. How do I become a great engineer? I said, become a musician first. And it doesn't even matter if you're a great musician. It matters that you understand musicians, you understand music, you know what a chorus is, you know what a verse is, you know structure of music. You absolutely have to know that in order to be a helpful person in the studio for an artist that wants to say something musically.
Bravo. Absolutely. So that ties into my next question. If you could tell my listeners how you were introduced to record producer James Guercio, because he handpicked you to become his chief engineer and assigned the task to convert a barn into a high-tech studio in Colorado called Caribou Ranch, where artists that included Chicago, the Beach Boys, Joe Walsh, Shaka Khan, Elton John, Billy Joel, and Earth, Wind, and Fire all recorded. And if you could also talk about the challenge of recording there at Caribou, because I understand it was very thin air due to high altitude.
Okay. James William Guercio is probably the most important person in my life. All right, let me tell you the story of how we got together. One of the fellows who was my mentor at CBS Records was another engineer. His name was Don Palouse. And Don was like an amazing engineer. He was like, as we had just talked about, Don was also a musician and had studied, music. And he, at one point, he had done the first 4 albums for Chicago. And there came a point in the scheduling that Don had made a commitment to Leonard Bernstein. And I'm not sure I remember what it was. It was either West Side Story or something, New York Philharmonic, but it was like a very important thing for CBS Records. And Don was probably the best engineer that they had to do something like that. And at the same time, Chicago wanted to come in and do Chicago 5, which was their 5th album. And I walked into the supervisor's office one day, and I looked down at the schedule, and there's my name as like the engineer for the Chicago record.
My God.
So I got to say this, that, the music business is a very funny business, and luck plays into it a lot.
Yes, it does.
Being in the right place at the right time is like something that you can't ignore being in the music business. So we did the record. The record was very, very successful. Jim liked me. The guys in the group liked me. And, we just got along so well. I loved the record the way it came out. The group loved the record the way it came out. It was successful. And during that period of time, Jimmy would say to me, I hate recording in New York City. I really do. You have to pay for hotel rooms. The guys are distracted. They're going out, I have this idea that, I bought property in Colorado, and I'm in the process of turning it into a resort recording studio. Would you have any interest in doing something like that? And I mean, of course, like, I couldn't say yes fast enough, because it was an opportunity that comes along like maybe once in a lifetime, really, for an engineer. And I must say this, he was quite a ways along in doing this studio situation. What he had done is and I think this is probably the best time to, give your listeners a really good view of what Caribou Ranch was, and all the aspects of it, because it really was a moment in time that occurred in the music business. He was, as I said, he was pretty far along. He had taken a piece of property that was owned by Transamerica, and basically what it was, prior to him taking it, was what in the vernacular would be a dude ranch. It was maybe 5 or 6, 7, 8 buildings that were really like kind of log cabins, authentic log cabins, but it was like really old. And a dude ranch was like where tourists would come in and go horseback riding, and maybe snowmobiling, or cross-country skiing, or whether it was like a vacation venue almost. Well, he had the idea that he's going to take. It had a very large 40-stall horse barn, and he completely gutted the place. This is before I even got involved. He completely gutted the place. He had a company called Westlake Audio and a guy by the name of Tom Hidley come in and acoustically design the studio for him. Tom Hidley had done the record plant in L.A. and New York, and was probably the premier studio designer of that time. And they completely gutted the building, and acoustically treated. It was 3 floors. There was a bottom floor that had a kind of a dining area, or like a snack kind of area with couches, a big fireplace, and a little kitchen in there. And the rest of the first floor was like a shop, and that's where they had their tape vault. I mean, it was like a complete studio setup with a shop that would support the studio that was up on the second floor. And it was a beautiful, beautiful studio. The control room was a quad control room with these 4 gigantic speakers in all 4 corners of the room that Tom Hidley had designed. And Jimmy had gone ahead and contracted a company from Canada to make what was going to be one of the first automated mixing consoles in the country. Automated mixing, if your listeners don't know what that is, that's when you're doing a mix, like say a 24-track mix with data and content and everything on an individual fader. Once you mix those together and do all the moves that you're going to do with them, either up, down, or turn this on, turn this off, an automated console would kind of memorize what that was and play it back to you. And you would actually see the faders moving up and down. And so this was like a state-of-the-art, and this was a prototype console that was in there. And that is the point at which I came into the picture, because the console was really an R&D project at the time, and Jimmy was really frustrated because it was breaking down, it wasn't consistent, and he needed somebody that was a recording engineer not a design engineer, to come in there and, kind of put the thing together. As I said, he was 80% there on a studio and all the, surrounding buildings and everything by the time that I got involved with it. And when I got involved with it, I got there and we worked on this console. We worked on it. I collaborated with the design engineer. And at one point in time, I finally came to Jimmy and I said, Jim, you can either have this studio take off or not. But if you continue to do just like a R&D project on this console, you're never going to have a recording studio. And we talked about it, and the next day, Jimmy calls me up and he said, listen, you're going to get a call from Pete Townsend, and he's going to make some recommendations to you about, like, we had talked about English consoles.
Wow.
The type of console. There was an English console designer in England called Rupert Neve, Neve, that had done all the consoles for, all the studios in London, the consoles that the Beatles were making records on.
Right.
And so that was the console that we eventually got in there. We took the prototype console, kind of put it in one of the spare rooms downstairs, and got this thing finally going. And it was my job, really, at that point in time. One, the studio was for Chicago, but it was also to be rented out to other people that would come there, take the studio for like 3 weeks at a time, and make a record, make an album. You could do the writing up there. I mean, usually they came in and they had, material written already, but it was to make a studio in like 3 weeks in a, pristine surroundings and, away from the hustle and bustle of the cities and kind of like a creative environment. So that was really the kind of the concept and the idea of Caribou Ranch. You had mentioned the thin air, and that was a bit of a problem. And it wasn't so much a problem in singing, but it was a problem in just kind of getting around, because the studio was at 8,600 feet, and even if you were just like, taking a hike, you would get winded. We actually did have, in the studio, we had oxygen tanks.
Really?
So that, yes, because, a horn section doing 3 hours of overdubs is going to, hey, can I have a taste of some little richer oxygen I've just been
wow.
Sucking in and throwing out, for the last 3 hours. So I will say this, though. Some of the finest vocals I think I've ever done were done in that studio. I mean, the vocal that I did with Terry Kath on actually Jimmy did a movie called Electrical Light and Blue. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie.
Oh, I've watched it.
It's like a cult movie now. It really is. But at the end of the movie, Terry sings the music that is the out credits to the movie, and I mean that's one of the which is one of the finest vocals I think I've ever cut with Terry. And it was kind of almost done in like one take, believe it or not. I mean, there were a couple of snips here and there that we had to put in, but it was an amazing vocal.
Tell me about the field. Tell me about the plans.
So yeah, the air was a bit of a problem, but it could be overcome. There wasn't,
Well, I remember hearing different interviews with Walt Parazater, the woodwind player from Chicago. He's the one that originally put the band together. And in certain interviews, he would talk about Caribou, how great it was, but how he would have to go to Boulder just to get some air. And I mean,
yeah,
the way Pankow would write with all those extremely high notes on all of them,
right,
they must have felt faint sometimes.
absolutely. It was, there were good things about it, but there were those things that you had to overcome really.
So, when you're recording any of the artists that we just mentioned, were you ever present in the studio when one or more of the classic hit songs were in the early stages of development? And did any of these artists ever have any interesting recording procedures that made them feel comfortable?
Okay, let's see. Well, I think I was honored and privileged and blessed to walk into the studio, because I was kind of like the I was the chief engineer, and it was really my job to make the engineer, and a lot of the groups would bring their own engineer. They had somebody that they were comfortable with, it was their engineer, it was somebody that the producer was comfortable with, so they came kind of up as a package, and it was my job to make that engineer feel really comfortable in a studio that he might never have been in before. And the only reason I could do that is that I was an engineer too. And I could show him quickly through everything and, kind of get him up and running and feeling really good about what he was hearing in pretty short order. So that in terms of making people feel comfortable, that was kind of what I did. And because of that, I can remember they called me up once. There was a problem in the studio with a monitor or something, and I came into the studio and I fixed it pretty quickly. And they say, "Come on in and stay and listen." It was an Elton John session, and they were doing "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds."
Oh, come on.
Yeah, and it was like really incredible to hear like the basic track and like a kind of a scratch vocal Elton had done on "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." The guy who was the producer of that, his name was Gus Dudgeon, and Gus always had the monitor up to like 12, and they ran the tape machine, and I swear to God, Scott, it was your face was almost distorted with the level at which he played the music. But it was amazing to hear something like that I heard probably, 6 months later as a finished record. But I heard it as like, the initial basic track of the record.
Wow. Were you still pinching yourself after working with Elton John in Chicago and all those people, or did as just another day in the studio?
Well, you have to, part of being a good engineer, good recording engineer, is making people feel comfortable with you. And the only way they feel comfortable with you is if you're authentic. And I really had like a kind of a personality that was neutral. And that works very well with artists and people that are famous, because they really want to hang with somebody that's a normal person, trust is very, very important. It's the thing that you really have to foster as a recording engineer, that when an artist goes into a studio, he knows that you have his back, and he knows what you want to, what he wants to hear in his earphones, and you can do that. So it's very important to make people feel comfortable in their environment.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I've had those experiences in the studio where, oh, so and so, the engineer is going to be here. It's going to be a piece of cake. This is fantastic. And then the one or two times that person's not there, oh, you pray, please, please give me a good mix in the phones.
Right, absolutely.
So after the various producers and musicians found out that you also played piano, what songs besides Biblos, which we'll talk later, that was composed by Terry Kath of Chicago, were you asked to play on other songs and for what artist?
Okay, actually, Biblos was probably one of just a few things that I played on. There was one group, and this is a really funny, I don't say funny, but it was like an unusual story for me. Jimmy had found an English group called Sailor. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. I
Yes,
think they only made one record.
I did. Yep.
Okay, but anyway, he kind of brought them up to the ranch, and he said, "You're going to go into the studio." He kind of produced it. You know, he wouldn't be there all the time. He kind of let them in the studio with me, and trusted me enough that I would let them get them where they wanted to be, and then he'd come in and he'd make his comments and kind of produce the record that way. And there was this one particular song that I was in the studio, and the one particular song required a kind of like a climactic high note in a portion of the song, which was like over, ensemble singing and a chorus. It was like a very climactic moment, and, the guys said to me, "Man, I wish we had a saxophone to like hit one of those really, those screamy high notes up there." And I said, "Well, I play saxophone."
Wow.
And they said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." And I didn't even have a saxophone with me up there, So they said, "Okay, well, we'll rent a saxophone for you." And they rented a saxophone down in Denver, brought the saxophone up, and I actually did this really. I haven't found that record in a while. I've been looking for it to remember what exactly I did, but I played on it, okay? And
How cool.
it really turned out well. I was able to, it was like an altissimo note that I was able to get out, after a couple of takes. But I got it out, and it just fit the part perfectly.
How cool is that?
It is cool, and I enjoyed doing it. I really did.
Wow. Hearing Chicago for the first time in the early 1970s was a pivotal moment in my life, especially hearing Terry Kath play guitar and sing for Chicago. He is one of the reasons I was inspired to become a musician, and Wayne, you know that already, including the influences of the other members of Chicago had on me. I know from talking to you in the past that Terry was a dear friend of yours. What was it like to be Terry's friend, and specifically, what was it like hanging with him while he was writing the song Biblos? That was 1974 on Chicago 7.
Okay, well, I think part of the concept of the studio, especially with respect to Chicago, was it was a place that they could come and write music. When the studio wasn't being used by somebody else, it was kind of open, and Jim would say to the guys, "Listen, come up here, stay in one of the cabins. Wayne's here. Go in the studio, write. Do a demo with him, and write a song, and bring it and introduce it to the group. So they did that a lot in several cases, and Terry, at that point in time, I should back up a little bit. At that point in time, I had already, bought a home up there. It's about 10 miles away from the studio, and I was living there with my wife, and the studio, the room, or not the room, but the house that I had been living prior to that was one of the houses that was on the ranch that Terry and his wife took when they would come down there. So we kind of lived in the same house at different times, and it was like kind of a thing that was always kind of a thing between us. Hey, you gotta, you don't have to. This is what you do when that fireplace backs up a little bit. So at any rate, Terry was writing this song, and he came into the studio, and of course, he played the parts. We kind of put a demo together, and he played guitar. We put a little bass on it, and Terry played a little bit of piano. Not much, but a little bit, and he said, I want to put a piano part. And I said, cool, go out there and do it. So he went out there and he played the piano on the part. We put it down there. I listened to what he was playing, and, he said, I kind of talked him into letting me play. I said, listen, why don't we try this? I'll go out there and I'll play. I understand what you're trying to play, but I think I have an idea for it. And I said, you'll be the recording engineer, and I'll be the musician. So I showed him how to operate the machines and everything, and he was like really into it. I said, oh man, this is fun. I like this. So I went out there and I played the part, and he really loved the part, that I played. And what eventually ended up happening with that particular record is we played this demo for the guys, and the guys said, well, listen, why don't we go out into the studio and we'll do a basic track. Terry playing guitar, and Robert Lamb went out there. He played piano, and the whole group went out there, drums and whatever, and they cut a basic track, and then they started putting overdubs on it and stuff, synthesizers, whatever, to make it the track that you actually eventually kind of heard on the record. And they had put almost everything else on it, and Terry finally said, well, listen, I want Wayne to play on the record too.
Wow.
And the guys all said, yeah, let's have Wayne play on the record.
How cool.
So they let me go out there, and what's on the record is me playing, which is, it was really kind of like a high point in my career as as a musician, really, to be able to get that acceptance and to be able to fit something in that I knew how to do onto a record that was going to be a record that millions of people would eventually hear.
Well, so I know the track from hearing it for many, many years, and what you play is very tasty. Because you're a musician, you have big ears, you know what should be played, what should not be played. So kudos to you. That's a high right there.
It is. It was one of the high points of my life.
So then I went home and I got it all. Sat down to write these words when I was finally alone. Then about halfway through, wondered if someone knew where she was so I could give her a call. Then I found out that she was right down the hall. Not too far away. But that's okay. I'll just wait for the day when I can see her again and spend some time.
Terry Kath was one of the best rock guitarists in the world. And when we tell this story, most people say, oh, you're full of it. This is before Wayne came along, I believe. They were at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and they were in the dressing room, and all of a sudden, Jimi Hendrix comes into the room, and he said, and they were all shocked. I think all their jaws were hanging open. He said, "Hey guys, your horn section sounds like one set of lungs, and your guitarist is way better than me."
That is a story that Jimmy loves to tell. He'll tell it 10 times a day and once on Sunday. Because it is true. Terry was an incredible guitarist.
I saw him with Chicago, the original Chicago that you work with, when I was a young kid. I saw them in North Jersey somewhere, an outdoor arena that's not even there anymore. And this is the first guitarist I've ever seen that could sing, play rhythm guitar, and lead at the same time.
Absolutely.
Oh, and he never repeated anything. He was inventive as hell. His voice was to die for. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. I mean, what a pleasure it must have been to be working with him and to be his friend. That must have been wild.
It was. And he was such a, Terry looks like he's a really kind of aggressive guy, but he is such a teddy bear in person when when you get to know him, and he's just hanging out with you and he's your friend. I mean, he was a wonderful person. He really, really was.
And he was a hell of a bass player. I think he played bass before guitar, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he was a great bass player.
Let's talk about now the other talent that you have as a professional instrument technician. And this includes the 3 generations of repairmen in your family, your dad, yourself, and your son, Chris. So how did you get interested in repairing musical instruments? Did your dad teach you how to become an instrument technician when you settled back in New Jersey? That eventually led to you taking over the family business. Then years later, you would teach your son, Chris, to become an instrument technician as well, and follow in your footsteps, thus carrying on the family business.
Well, I must say this, that I was, my father I used to cut my allowance by being my father's apprentice when I was, I don't know, maybe, when do you get an allowance? I guess when you're kind of 10 years old or something.
Right.
And he taught me how to cork and pad, and how to take the instrument apart in a very specific way. And I was kind of like his assistant. I would prepare an instrument for him. If it was like a clarinet overhaul or whatever, I would prepare the instrument, and then he would put it back together, which is really the part that takes real skill. I mean, putting the pads in is a thing that I could teach maybe almost anybody, and if they practice it enough, they could do it right. But to put the instrument back together again and voice it is where the real talent comes along. So, I mean, I had learned this when I was very, very young. And then, of course, I went on, to do something else, which was the engineering. And there became a time, Scott, when, I was kind of getting, I don't know how to put this to you, kind of getting, I don't want to say fed up, but I was losing interest in being a recording engineer. First of all, it's kind of tough on your home life because you're away a lot. If you're a freelance engineer, you're on the road. And I really kind of decided I wanted to do something else. So there was a transition period kind of at the end of my recording career where I was working in the studio, and when I wasn't in the studio, I was in the shop because I just said to my dad, listen, you're going to be retiring soon, so why don't you give me the keys to the shop, and I think I'd like to do this and have a normal 9-to-5 life and watch my son grow up. And that's the point at which I, entered the business world of, instrument restorations and repairs and servicing.
So I know about your dad, Wally. He was great. He was my woodwind technician, and then that turned over to you, and then Chris, and both of you now. But let my listeners know a little bit about Wally. I know he studied instrument repair at Dorn and Kirshner, and you mentioned Billy Dorn.
Right. Well, yeah. Actually, Billy Dorn was one of the original owners in Dorn and Kirshner, and they had kind of a parting of ways, I guess. And like Billy Dorn went over to City. That's where I used to take my lessons on the vibes. Was in City Music, which was right across the street from Dorn and Kirshner on Springfield Avenue in Newark. My dad only had like a 8th grade education. He became a musician before he was going to go into high school. They said to him, Wally, you're not paying attention in school, and you're always thinking about music, and therefore, you should probably be a musician. And that's what he did. And he learned the instrument repair business actually in the Army. He was in the Army band, and he would go over to the place where they would service the instruments in the Army band, and he would just watch the guy, and learn. My dad was very mechanical, so he picked up things quickly, and of course he was a player, so he knew when they were working and when they weren't working. So that's how he learned the craft, and he was probably, at that period of time, when he was in business, he was, I think, probably the premier instrument technician in the Central Jersey, certainly maybe even Northern Jersey too area. And he had guys coming in from New York as well. So he was very good at his craft and an amazing technician. I learned so much from him.
Oh, I agree. I mean, long before I met you or Chris, I would go to Wally like once or twice a year or whatever. So one time I took my horns to Wally and I noticed one of the Chicago albums hanging on the wall. And I asked Wally, I says, "Oh, are you a Chicago fan? Why is it there? I'm just curious." He said, "Oh," and that's when he told me that you were the chief engineer at Caribou Ranch and you were his son.
He was very proud of that record. I mean, that record is the one that I played on, and he did love Chicago as well, because for him, it was real music, so to speak. It wasn't, it was a different kind of rock and roll that had, real musical roots in it, and he appreciated the group very much.
Was it your dad that was fixing the horn players' horns, and I guess they said, "Hey, why don't you come on the road with us?"
That was Clarence Clemens.
Oh, I got it mixed up. I'm sorry, Clarence Clemens.
Yeah, that was Clarence Clemens. And Clarence had heard about my dad, and he would bring his horns over for my dad to fix, and he loved the way my dad fixed his horns. I wasn't around as much during that period of time. It was I was still doing studio stuff at that time, so my dad was really doing the work. And Clarence said, "Wally, I want you to come on the road with me." And he got all excited about it. Honest to God, he was up in age at that point in time. And, my dad came to me, he said, "Clarence wants me to come on the road. Do you think I should do it, Wayne?"
Wow.
I said, "I don't know, Dad. I don't know if you're ready for the road at your age." So eventually he did not do it, and, but Clarence, it really appreciated his work and always brought his stuff to my dad.
Isn't that beautiful? I have another story about your dad, and this is where it ties in how I met you. So I was on the road with a show band, and I just bought like 4 or 5 new horns, and we're on stage. What a show band does, you play dance sets, and then you put on a show, and it's a variety of different types of music and entertainment, and the young listeners are now going, "What?" So that's a discussion or a show for another time. But I'll never forget, I was like, "Oh, I got my brand new horns." It took me like a month to pick these things out. So we took like a 5-minute break. I went to get, a soft drink at the bar, and I'm looking at the stage, and I notice this gentleman gets up and goes towards my horns. I'm going, what's going on here? And then I see that he's not walking correctly. I'm going, oh, God, it looks like he's drunk. As soon as I thought that, he falls down on top of my horns. The alto falls down onto the tenor, onto the soprano, onto the flute, and I thought I was going to have a stroke. I just bought these instruments. Ugh, I run upstage. I'm going, what's going on? Well, you just ruined my horns. And he was so drunk, he was passed out. I tried to get the manager. No one cared. We had to go back on stage and play. And the tenor and alto would not play at all. And I was just devastated. And I looked, and there was dents. These are brand new horns, dented.
Yeah.
I was sick to my stomach. So we happened to have off, I think the next couple of days. So I flew back from Ohio to New Jersey with my horns. I called your dad. I said, Wally, I got to come in. My brand new horns are ruined. Yeah, don't worry. We're going to fix it up. Come on down. So I come on down. Your dad says from the kitchen, go downstairs with your horns. I'll be right there. So I walk downstairs, and there's a gentleman standing in front of me, and he extends his hand to shake my hand. He says, Scott, I'm Wayne. How are you? I'm so happy to meet you. I'm Wally's son, and I'm going to look at your horns. And all of a sudden, I just paused, and I'm going, and I looked at the Chicago album, and I'm like, Ralph Cramden, because I was one of those geeks that knew all the album credits and knew about you, and I was speechless. I couldn't talk but the good thing is it took my mind off of the dents in my horns.
Right.
And you were so nice and so, soft-spoken and saying, I can take care of this. Don't worry about it. Then your dad comes down. Don't worry. We're going to have this done for you, okay? So come back next week. We'll have it done. To this day, I still have the same alto and tenor. They're great horns, and you know them very well from all the years I brought it to you, your dad, and your son. But you fixed it like nothing ever happened. And I was so relieved. I mean, what a catastrophe. But I can't thank you enough and your dad for talking me down off that tree that day.
Well, as I've said before, instruments are so personal to musicians. Yeah. There's this famous story about Dizzy Gillespie that was walking down New York City streets one evening, and he was stopped by a guy who wanted to mug him, and saw his trumpet. He says, I'm going to take that trumpet. And, Dizzy said, here, take the trumpet. And he said, but I want my mouthpiece.
Right. If you're a musician, you understand that.
Right.
Wow, that's funny. So let me ask you, do you miss being a recording studio engineer? I remember you telling me years ago about the time when you were freelancing as an engineer in New York.
I miss it, Scott, when I hear a really good record that's engineered well. And, it kind of transports me back to those times. And, that's when I miss it. I'll tell you, one of the really blessed parts of being a recording engineer is when you walk into an elevator and you hear something that you have done 20 years ago, still playing, in an elevator or a bar or anything else like that. It really is a real kick, and it really brings you back to, wow, I really did that, man. That was it was a moment in time. It was a picture that I painted, so.
Wow. Yeah. Savor that. I mean, those are special moments. So let me ask you, I know you also do vintage horn restorations.
Well, my kind of, as you know, my son kind of took over WT Music, and we had run it up into a rental business, services, sales, and recently, just before the pandemic, my son decided to get out of the rental business and just run it as a repair shop. And so what I picked up on is I kind of have narrowed my focus on what I enjoy doing as to really doing vintage horn restorations, like overhauling those old Mark VIs and balanced actions and super balanced actions. And the really niche that I really want to get into in the future is doing really high-end flutes, like Haynes and Pels. Because I have done them, I'm very good at them, and I think there's a real market for them because it is probably the most difficult thing that you can do as a instrument technician.
Playing a Haynes myself, I've always admired and appreciated everything you've done with my flute, and that takes a lot more time than people understand. I mean, saxophone, clarinet, yes, it takes a lot of time to do it correctly, but a flute pad, oh, wow. I mean, right? That's difficult stuff.
The reason for that, Scott, is flute pads are in a cup, and behind the cup and behind the pad are shims. And the shims are 1/1000th of an inch thick. And the shims are to make sure that pad covers the tone hole perfectly. And with high-end flutes, it's especially important because the pads are harder and they're not as compliant. You have to be absolutely spot on as to adding a shim, taking a shim out, so that pad covers correctly and the flute will actually speak.
Do you have any musical or life philosophies that you live by?
If I'd give you one thing, it would be always look ahead for the next thing that you can be passionate about. I mean, I've just mentioned what, I am passionate about still now, a very specific, narrowed area of endeavor when it comes to musical instruments. But I think that's really, something that as you go through in life is to find that next thing. And you're not always going to do one thing in your life, for example, you're now doing a podcast as well as being a musician. And I think it's great because I think you have a really, a gift, a speaking gift, a structural gift in terms of, making people feel comfortable and speaking about music. And I know music is very important to you. So, if I have one philosophy, it would be to find out that next thing that really turns you on and you become passionate about.
So what advice could you share with someone that's listening to you right now and thinking about doing the same things as you?
Well, as I said before, anybody that's going to think about becoming a recording engineer, I would very much advise you to start playing music first. Okay, you can have an interest in electronics and recording and maybe getting an education in that, but you have to be a musician first. I mean, so in terms of being a recording engineer, that would be my advice to anybody that's going to do that. And in terms of the technician part is hard for me because, I've been asked so many times if I would teach somebody, actually by a lot of musicians, quite frankly, that would like to learn to be a technician. And I just say to them, you learn this over many, many, many years. And, kind of some of the tricks that my father taught me, he would not teach somebody else. He would only teach me because I'm his son. And it's kind of like so to be a good technician, there are now a lot of places that do you teach that as a course? I believe Eastman has a program like that. So I would tell them that it's still important to be a musician if you're going to be a technician. A technician that is not a musician is he does not. You have to be able to feel what a musician would feel, because a lot of it, when it comes to your instrument, is all feel. The weight of the keys up and down, it is all important. And in order to do that well, I think you have to think at least like a musician and kind of put yourself in their body when you're working on their instruments. So that's my two advice. You got to start with being a musician first.
How can my listeners reach you to go to your shop?
Okay, well, it is all through WT Music and Son. We are on the internet. Just, Google WT Music, and we'll come up, the numbers there. I don't do social media, so you can't reach me anywhere on social media. Chris does some of it, but and really Chris runs the shop now. It is his business. I kind of retired from it, although I still work at it. But it's really his business now. And our idea is to make this strictly a professional shop. We'll do student horns if they're recommended by, their teachers, and we do a lot of teachers in the area. So that's mainly how we work. So it's not the way it used to be, which was just like an open shop and anybody could come in. It really is now strictly a professional shop, and that's how you contact us, through WT Music and Son.
And in addition, go check out the albums that Wayne has recorded and engineered. You can tell a sonic difference when he has his hands on that console. I can hear a difference right away. Well, listen, Wayne, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I've known you for many years, and I admire and respect you and your son very much. And I learned some things today that I didn't even know about you. So that was great for me. And I know you really taught a lot of things to my listeners, and it was very entertaining as well.
Thanks, Scott. I really enjoyed this. It's enjoyable talking to somebody that has been in the music business and knows as many aspects of it as you do. So I thank you for it, for the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. Well, listen, have a great night. Tell Chris I said hi, and I will talk to you real soon because I have to actually stop by before the next show to get some of my horns adjusted.
Real good, Scott. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for joining me on today's show. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and could hear why my guest got chops. Please spread the word to your family and friends about my podcast, and if you would like to discuss Got Chops in between episodes, you can reach me on Instagram at Got Chops Podcast and on Twitter at Grimaldi Music. I can also be reached on Facebook, Scott Grimaldi, The Color of Midnight. My website is grimaldimusic.com, and the address for this podcast is anchor.fm/gotchops. Before I conclude with today's show, I'd like to share a catchphrase of mine that you'll probably hear me say quite often, for I truly believe it sums up what every artist has in common in order to achieve their chops. And it goes like this: it's not my way, it's the way it is. Join me on the next episode when we discover why my next guest got chops.